Hi, I'm Rayla White Spreggins, founder of Asada's House, and welcome to Tending Our Gardens. This offering is part of our holistic postpartum support initiative for Black and Brown families in Philadelphia, funded by the Reinvestment Fund. We created it because new parents deserve nourishment, not only food, but community, guidance, and care that honors the fullness of their being. What you're about to watch is an asynchronous workshop from our educational series. We kept these sessions real and grounded so they feel like being in the room with us. Wherever you're joining from, I invite you to arrive as you are. Take a breath, get comfortable, and let this be a moment of tending to your body, your spirit, and your postpartum journey. Thank you for allowing us to walk alongside you. We're glad you're here. So let's begin. Lex Wiley, they, them, theirs, is a farmer geographer. They study how Black communities historically and currently use agriculture to make home places, foster communities, and ancestral connection. Lex studied environmental science in the Department of Biodiversity, Earth, and Environmental Science at Drexel University and is currently a doctoral student in geography at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. As a native Philadelphian with roots in the Carolinas, their background informed their academic studies and community teaching and research work about the ways in which Black communities connect with nature. The enrichment of their farming and formal academic education contributed to the development of the community based land centered educational program, Lessons of the Land. They continue to teach in academic and common modalities. In this workshop, we'll learn the basics of growing food and herbal medicines at home or in a community garden. Growing goes beyond raising plants. It also reminds us to take stock of our personal growth.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Lex. I'm really excited to be offering this kind of like workshop through Asada's House and attending our gardens project. And we will be talking about urban earthwork, which is a way to just kind of think about working the land through growing, through herbalism, through community gathering, and how urban earthwork really is a way that we can also grow ourselves in addition to like growing food and medicine. So we are going to talk about, earthwork as a practice and a philosophy, understanding how it connects to our personal growth, really break down the practical growing skills. It's a very important time to, I think, to learn how to grow food with cuts to so many benefits and programs that we all have a right to have access to. Um, but I think also just with the way that the environment is changing, the way food markets are changing, it just feels really critical for us to have access to what makes us feel good and for it not to be exorbitant and expensive. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about practical growing skills. And then kind of scattered throughout the presentation are like resources that can support your growing journey. So whether it's like storefronts that you can go to or things to read online or people to talk to in the city. I tried to include other kind of like communities um, and whatnot that could really be helpful, I think, in sourcing all the things you need to get started on growing. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. And then we'll kind of dive right into the materials. And so I'm a farmer trained at Sankofa Community Farm at Bartram's Gardens. I worked there for 4 years. And through that work, I'm also what I consider still a budding herbalist. Um, and most of that is through like foraging on that farmland. I'm trained as an ecologist. I'm also a community educator, so I do workshops and curriculum writing and things of this nature all across the country, really for different farms and environmentalist groups. And most currently, I am also a graduate student researcher at Rutgers University, getting a degree in geography, but using that to study how Black growers use the kind of cultivation of food as a way of making place in the Americas. And so moving into the meat of our workshop. Right now it's fall, but the weather is really feeling like winter. And for me, as a grower and as a farmer, this is really the time of the year when we're taking stock. We're winding down our activities in the field because the plants are winding down their activities. The leaves are turning brown, plants are withering up, birds are migrating, things of that nature. And so we're packing up the farm, taking stock of what we grew, um, making medicine, saving seeds from the last of what's being produced in our fields, and really also looking inward about what kind of year we had as farmers or growers. For me, how well did my tomatoes grow this year? How well did my okra grow? But the practical questions about what we're doing in the field also very much connect to the kind of like personal questions and personal reflection, really, that we're also going through. And in that way, we're kind of taking a cue from nature. And so for me, some of the questions I'm also asking when I'm thinking about my garden or the farm is also, what kind of year did I have, not just as a grower and a worker, but as a person? Were there things that I wanted to do that I didn't get to do? And maybe how do I want to carry those into the next year? Um, and, in a real sense, I ask myself, how do I want to grow personally and practically? What are the things I want to grow and how do I want to grow them in terms of food? But also, like, what are the qualities I want to nurture in myself in this coming year? And what things did I practice well versus which things do I want to work on practicing in the future? And so, in light of this kind of like timing of the year, I think that it's important and in your own time to kind of look at these questions and take stock of what's going on in your life and how you're feeling, and how maybe you can connect that to a practical growing journey and growing your food. And so planting a garden is not all that dissimilar from personal reflection and growth. Um, Similarly to considering what you need when we're talking about our garden, you have to consider what kind of foods do you favor? What kind of herbs do you favor? Do you use often in your kitchen? Um, what is like your biggest dream about what your garden space could look like, similar to what your biggest dream for your life could be? And then also you got to factor in, what are my abilities and my comfortability in doing this work? If you don't like being hot, that might change, some of the things you want to grow or how you want to grow them. But all of these types of like reflections are also kind of factoring in. And for me, I kind of call these like lessons from the land. What is the land telling me, teaching me about myself, and how do I use these reflections back into this work? So when I started growing, I was in my early 20s, and this is a time where I was coming into my own person, but I didn't really know who I was. But by working the land, I really figured out or learned about myself that I could be patient because plants take a long time to grow. They don't grow on our time, they grow in their own time, right? I learned faith. There were often times I planted things that didn't look like they were going to make it, and they did. And I just had to trust that by nature itself, they would show up, excuse me, and do what they had to do if that was what they wanted. I learned a balance between how to be gentle, but also how to be strong, because plants could be really delicate when they're young, but if I have to move a bunch of soil, that takes a lot of strength too. And so there's a bunch of qualities about myself that I not only learned and discovered, but also developed. And now as an adult, I realize that many of my childhood interests in being outside, um, are now realized through this career that I have in the outdoors that as a kid didn't even really seem possible. And so, not that you'll necessarily discover that you'll be an ecologist or a researcher or a farmer, but you might discover something about yourself, and or discover a new relationship with plants, with nature, with life, or with your community. Um, and so for me, this is really what like earthwork is about. It goes beyond the plants in the soil and it extends to people too, both us as the people who are doing that work, but also in community with other people who may or may not be involved. And really, because we're all living beings, we all impact each other. We're all sharing nutrients. We're all sharing, doing some type of work. The plants are food for us. The plants get fed from the soil, so caring for the soil helps us care for ourselves, things of that nature. We share similar needs, plants as a living thing, they eat. Some plants kind of sleep. They definitely communicate. And so we reflect a lot of the same characteristics. And so, with that in mind, when you think about growing from this kind of earthwork perspective, some of the lessons or some of the questions you can kind of keep in your heart as you're embracing this practice is how can working the earth through growing food and making medicine teach us about loving ourselves? And what other ways do we grow? And I mean this in like a personal sense. And what other ways do we grow personally by supporting plants and soil in their growth? And in turn, how do they support our growth? How are we all connected? How are we a part of an ecology and our ecosystem? So let's keep those reflections in our heart, but I want to bring us into like some of the more practical skills of how to grow food. Um, yeah, so the first question, and really there's like three questions you ask yourself is what do I want to grow? Where do I want to grow it? And then how do I actually do it? And so with the first question, I want us to like think about or maybe like write a list of 5 to 10 crops or foods that you know that you love. Pick 5 to 10 fruits and vegetables. And it can be from something that like, oh, you love the taste to, it's just a fruit or a vegetable that always makes it into a meal that you're making. For me, that looks like leafy greens, so collards or kale or mustard greens or turnip greens, there's a lot of them. It looks like garlic and onions, peppers, tomatoes, okra, black eyed peas. I can keep going on, but those are my staples, right? And so I highlighted them here in this kind of like crop list just to like give you an example of some of the essential foods that I'm working with that I know no matter what is going on from season to season, these are the things that I'm going to plant. So I invite you to make a list of things, of fruits and vegetables that you know you like, because those are always the best things to start to grow. Um, so all of these crops, they're gonna have different seasons in which they grow. They're kind of like us in the sense that they have a favorite season. I don't know about y'all. I love the summertime. That's when I feel most like a person. As such, the winter is tiring me out a little bit. And plants aren't that dissimilar. They're having a similar experience. And so the seasons really are what kind of defines how well that they grow. So for vegetables, we're typically harvesting and eating their leaves and their roots. And so the best season to harvest them is when their leaves and fruits are at the largest size, but also like the best texture. Like you don't want a potato that's super hard, um, or a green that's like crisp because it's dried out, right? We want them to have a texture that we expect and appreciate. For fruits, it's a little different. So we want them, and for flowers too, we want to eat them when the flowers are at their most optimal or the fruits are at their ripest. And again, texture kind of factors into that. But that's kind of what determines the seasonality of the different crops that we're going to eat. So I've taken up here is this the Penn State Extension Masters Gardener's Philadelphia Growing Guide. That's a lot of words. Basically, this table from the Growing Guide just kind of like maps out when's the best time to grow certain foods. And the names here are you will be growing them from seed. So for instance, if I wanted to grow onions, the best time to take onion seeds and plant them in the ground would be in mid-March. And that's the earliest that I should be doing that. The latest that I should do it is in mid-April. And so that's kind of like first date is the earliest you can plant something from seed. Last date is the latest time period before they might not make it to a point where they're harvestable or they taste good. But it's a guide. It's not a hard and fast rule. And so some other common crops, I talked about garlic. I've talked about other leafy greens like collards, kale, mustards, turnips, cabbages, etc. All of these It's a great time to plant them in mid-March from seeds, but I wouldn't plant watermelons, for instance. I wouldn't plant them in March. It's too cold. I'd plant them in May. Same with okra. So they have all the warmth that they need because they like to be warmth, but they also have all the other nutrients and benefits that come with the summer season that they may not get otherwise. And I just highlighted the rest of these are just some of the other crops that I mentioned. And if you follow this QR code, it'll take you to the actual website and the guide, and you can explore more resources there. But all in all, planting things in their appropriate season, um, once you know what they are, is one of the essential steps to growing your own food. I mentioned that the second question is thinking about where you want to grow. Now, it's not optional. Well, it is nowadays, but most plants need soil in order to grow. If you are fancying, you have a connection to the kind of like aquaponics, hydroponics systems, which that means like growing in water and adding like growth chemicals to them. There are some organizations that do that in Philly. I am not connected with them. I'm a very traditional grower. I like to grow in soil. So that's what we will be talking about. But all in all, in my opinion, plants grow best in the soil. Um, and hmm, Soil is where plants get their water, where they get their minerals, kind of like the equivalent of vitamins for us, and other nutrients at. And so they can only be as healthy as the soil that they're growing in. Now, some plants can thrive in contaminated environments, but that's not what we want for the food that we grow. And in a city like Philly, where most of our soils are contaminated, it makes it a challenge to like find access to places where we can grow our own food. And you don't have to be a soil scientist to understand that. We know this from our everyday experiences. We walk around our neighborhoods in Philly. We know that what it's like. But there are some solutions to that, and we'll talk about it on the next slide. But I just wanted to take a minute to like briefly kind of break down these graphics on the page. On the left, we're seeing kind of like a simplified chart about the kind of relationships that plants have with the soil. And so, one in the soil, you can see that there's a bunch of living organisms like fungi and bacteria that exist there. That's what makes soil living. And they exchange nutrients and water with the plants, and the plants do the same thing, which is why their health is tied to each other. And then the graph on the right is talking about then how soil and plants then connect to our health. And so it's very deeply complex, but I just kind of want us to really get that idea of how we're all connected to one another and how soil being healthy, the health of the land impacts the health of the people. Or as we say at Sankofa, as with the land is with the people, right? And so looking at some of the solutions to growing, first we have garden beds. So this could be a wood bed or a metal bed. I know some people who have used like concrete um, blocks or those kind of like construction um, concrete kind of materials, paving stones is the word I was trying to say, to construct a garden bed that's maybe 6 inches to 12 inches tall. It's very common to put landscape fabric or cardboard or not plastic bags, sorry, paper bags, some type of barrier between the soil on the ground and the garden bed and the soil that will go in it to prevent contamination across that border. And so you can grow in spaces that have contaminated soil by making a barrier and growing on top of them and providing enough soil for the plants to do their thing. And so that's kind of just how garden beds work. And this one is just an example of a garden bed from my front yard. But yeah, I got some wood panels, nailed that together, put it up. It's a really nice buildable. Mine is a kit, but we'll talk about later some other places where you can source garden beds. The other solution to this kind of soil problem is growing in grow bags or in pots. Grow bags are made of like a thicker landscape material. Pots can be made of plastic, ceramics, folks grow in buckets, things like that. Again, it's not in the ground, so it's not in a space where soil is contaminated. Um, and it actually makes the plants a lot more transportable and easier to move. And it's a really great way to grow if you have limited yard space or front porch space or sidewalk space, but you still want to get started. And then lastly is growing in a community garden, of which there are almost 400 in Philadelphia. And so there's lots of opportunities. And you can see here, like this community garden in Southwest, for instance, has several garden beds that they're also using pots. And so at a community garden, you wouldn't necessarily have to buy the materials to make the bed or buy the pots. But there may be like other ways that you're expected to show up and contribute, but they all kind of come with their different price points, different ways of being flexible. And it's really about like, how much growing space do you want? Um, and yeah, I guess like what your access to materials are. And so if you don't have a lot of growing space, but you want to try a community garden might be a good option. A grow bag might be a good option. If you have yard space, then a combination of grow bags and garden beds might work for you. And so to break down where we can get all these things from, there are so many programs in the city for garden beds. Um, and excuse me, there's so many places where you can source these types of garden bed kits, like I showed in the last slide. So there's wooden kits and metal kits, and most hardware stores, but especially the big ones like Lowe's and Home Depot. But the major thing I want to highlight is the neighborhood garden bed program at Bartram's Garden. And so there is a team that's a part of Sankofa Farm that builds the beds, delivers the beds, the soil, and the plants to you with a guide on how to get started. And it's on a sliding scale to purchase the beds and all those materials. And so if you scan this QR code, you can kind of register with them and they can, at some point in the future, in this upcoming season, install a garden bed for you. But they also, the people who run that program, do building workshops through this collective in Southwest called Southwest and West Agricultural Group or Network. And so they teach you how to build those garden beds, and then they teach you what materials, what screws to use, how to screw the beds together, all the things that you can think of, they will show you how to do. And that way you now are empowered to go out there, get the materials, and learn how to build it yourself. Pots and grow bags you can find at most hardware stores in the city. But for community gardens, I mentioned there's over 400 of them. But some of my favorites are Sankofa, Reinhardt, the Philadelphia Orchard Project's Learning Orchard at the Woodland Cemetery. In West Philly, there's the Mantua Community Garden, the Summer Winter Garden, Freedom Greens and Gardens, North Philly, Glacius Gardens, North Square Neighborhood Projects, Glenwood Green Acres. And the places I'm naming are pretty established with like garden beds, with a list that you can join in the like spring season to start growing in those spaces. They offer workshops, they have lots of structures and support. But if these aren't in your neighborhood or if their like waiting lists are full, you can go to this link at groundedinphilly.org that has a much more comprehensive list of all the other community gardens. And there may be one that's just around the corner that's looking for someone to start growing there. Um, but just to give you an idea, these are some of the places that you can go. But no matter where you go to grow, your soil is still going to need care. And so we had this graphic a few slides ago, right, that was showing the nutrients in the soil. But it kind of goes beyond. Though there are nutrients in the soil, you have to keep feeding your soil and caring for your soil. It's kind of similar. If plants have a preference for season, well, soil has a preference for how it's cared for too. So the three tips I would like say is keeping your soil covered. You can use leaves, dried leaves. You can use hay. You could just plant it densely. You want to keep the soil covered to keep moisture in the soil, to keep weeds out of the soil, things of that nature. You want to water it regularly. Soil gets thirsty and plants get thirsty just like us, and they need water in order to function well. And lastly, you want to feed your soil. So many of you have probably heard of compost. Um, in the most basic sense, just adding fruit and vegetable scraps, just burying it in your pots, burying it in the garden beds is already composting. You don't need to buy a fancy compost tumbler or make a compost pile necessarily. You don't have to add coffee grounds or eggshells or meat and take fancy measurements and do a bunch of math. You can just add those scraps into your garden, bury them well, and the soil and the plants will handle the rest. And if you're at a community garden, they may have those materials already there, which then is like very helpful for you to not have to figure out how to do that. But they also may offer workshops, like I know Swag offers a composting workshop with actually Freedom Greens and Gardens in the spring season every year. So now that we've kind of talked about um, what we want to grow, where we might want to grow it, the next stage is kind of planning your garden, right? So, I talked about growing onions, for instance. So it's kind of hard to see now, but they're like these light green onions and garlic outline. So this might be how I like plan that out in the bed. And then maybe I said I want to grow collard greens or leafy greens, and so I'd, kind of plant them because they need less sunlight, because they need cooler weather. They don't need to be as close to the sun. And it'll make a little more sense when I start adding these like summer crops in. Stick with me. So I would, plant my collard greens, my mustard greens, and whatnot on the inside of my bed. I'd plant them within this kind of like onion garlic fence, if you will, because I know that squirrels and cats don't like the taste of them, or deer, which means they would have to try to bite through the onion and garlic tendrils to get at my greens, and in the process they'll get disgusted out. They'll leave them alone. So it's like a natural repellent to that, but also is a great use of space. And then, it's summertime, and now I'm ready to grow some summer crops. And so I plant my okra, where the sun is kind of like passing every day, closer to the sun because it needs a lot of sun and warmth. But tomatoes also need a lot of sun and warmth. And it's fine if they're kind of blocking the sun from these crops because they don't need a lot of sun and they don't need to be super warm. Oh, there's my soil. Great. I do like an herb like hibiscus. That's one of my favorite herbs back here. Because it also likes sun and warmth, but it definitely will grow taller than the onions and the greens. And so it can get plenty of sun. It could stay warm. Similarly with the peppers. Peppers are a summer crop, but they can take a little shade and they can be a little cool. So I might structure things in such a way that everyone's getting their needs met, but they're also supporting each other. And then lastly, fortunately couldn't find a melon icon, but think of these as my watermelons. I do my melons in the corner because I don't know if you've ever seen a melon or a pumpkin or a squash grow, but they vine and they take up a lot of space. So I love to put them in the corner so they can just kind of run free in the rest of the yard and don't run all over these crops that I'm also trying to grow. Um, and so in the spring, there'll be like another workshop that kind of builds on what we're talking about here. And I can break this down a lot more detail. But also, again, through Swag and some of these other community gardens, they also break this information down a lot more. But the idea of kind of planning your garden in this is meant to be like a garden bed structure, is finding a way to balance the use of space with what you want to grow and what these plants need. And so these summer crops, because they like to be warm in the warmer seasons, that tells you that they like sunlight. So I put them in a place where they can access sunlight very easily. But I also balance that with the plants that don't need a lot of that sun. Um, then I've also used plants, and we didn't really talk about this, but I use plants like onions and peppers that naturally most animals don't like. They find them too spicy or gross tasting, to protect the plants that they do find very tasty, like my greens. So kind of working with the qualities of these plants to make a garden that thrives. And of course, many of these things are flowering, which means then that my pollinators, my bees, my butterflies are also kind of helping to maintain what's happening here. But not everything can be grown in a bed, or maybe you're not growing in a bed, and so it's totally fine to grow in a pot. So if I wanted to grow, I've grown hibiscus in a pot. If I wanted to grow tomatoes in a pot, that's always a great option. And you could just do one plant per pot. If you're growing herbs like lavender, any of that, mint especially, I would keep in a pot. And that way they're transportable, they have their own space to grow, but they're still in a soil medium that's thick enough. Yeah. And so there's many other options online for different types of like planting guides. I just kind of did this garden bed structure and like space breakdown just to demonstrate one of the many options of how you could like plant um, the types of foods that I'm interested in, which may be some of the ones that you're interested in growing. Um, so yeah, I just yapped about all these kind of technical aspects of growing your own food and medicine if we're talking about hibiscus and some of the other herbs at home. And there are, or rather, you can probably tell that there's so much that one I left out. Um, and by nature, we won't always get it right. There's so much to learn. I've been growing professionally for 5 years. I've been growing for fun since I was a kid, and I still don't know what I'm doing with certain crops. I've been trying to grow watermelons at home for 3 years, and the biggest watermelon I've gotten is like this big. So, you know, mistakes happen, and that's completely normal. Um, and I also would say that mistakes are and imperfections are the business of life. Many of the food plants that we have on that list that I showed that we enjoy are the result of like a natural imperfection that apparently was still worth having and worth living, worth tasting and worth cooking with. And so, in that similar way, you know, um, imperfections are a part of the process. Us making mistakes are part of the process, and we can use them as learning opportunities, but also as just like moments of curiosity and wonder that kind of keep fueling our journey. So, for instance, this summer I was trying to grow watermelons and I planted them too closely to a type of squash, and the squash took over the fence. And I learned immediately, okay, these two have to be grown in completely different spaces in my house or not at all. But I also was still amazed that the watermelon plants kind of came up, and I was very optimistic that they would grow. And even though they didn't, it was really nice to even just like appreciate the attempt at life and to learn that lesson. And so many other things did grow well in the garden despite that mistake, right? Um, and so working the earth, doing earth work, growing your own food, making your own medicine from these kind of crops, doing this practice doesn't require perfection. And at the end of the day, it really boils down to our effort, our patience, and our consistency in showing up and keep trying to do this work. And so in that same vein, a personal growth journey isn't just about, a personal growth journey through growing your own food and medicine will also embody like lessons around how to make your own food, how to cook your own food, how to harvest it, um, you know, finding moments of like discovery where you didn't expect that you'd learn something about yourself. I remember I did not expect to learn that I liked snakes, but I learned that in my practice and my work. And you might come across other journeys through growing your own food as well. I know many growers in Philly, including myself, who've also gone through like very transformative journeys healing ancestral trauma on the land, through what we grow, and even just the fact that we are Black people growing food and given that history of enslavement. And it's been very healing for many of us to join into that practice as free people. And so you may find yourself experiencing a journey like that you didn't, or something completely unexpected and unknown. Um, but all of these experiences are valid and can be very potent. And so, kind of concluding and wrapping up here, but I really hope that you kind of are leaving with an understanding of, how to grow your food, but also the kind of lessons and reflections and growth that growing your own food and having a relationship with the natural world um, and with your food and your food system can really give you, how can what the type of work and the effort that you're putting into the soil, into these plants, into your family when you're sharing this food or your community, even when you're preparing and cooking it, what does that teach us about how to care for ourselves? What does that teach us about like our cultural roots or how to share materials and resources and things of that nature? I could keep going on and on. But yeah, I just want to thank you all for listening. And I hope that this workshop was useful. And I hope to see some of you in the spring so we can keep building on this momentum of growing our food and growing ourselves and how they're all connected. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was incredible. It just felt like such an amazing way to lay the foundation to tending our gardens, and the way that you spoke about land-based practices as it being a potential pathway to connecting with yourself and
Mm-hmm.
ancestral work felt like it deeply resonated.
Yeah.